So our main topic today is on resident-led and collective housing development as a model for Aotearoa. Introduce myself as well. So I'm Zola. I'm working with Common Ground, which is set up for regenerative housing. And regenerative is quite a broad term. It does include an element of resident or community involvement and participation. And it also includes elements of ecological consideration and being able to speak to the wider systems that any project could seek to influence and positively make an impact on. So that regenerative idea is really that we have systemic issues, and within a particular project, we can actually deal with some of those systemic problems in a place-based way. Whether it's ecological, social, economic, and in this case for housing, it would be all three of those things. So in terms of resident-led, there's many different types, and you might hear these terms utilized. So co-housing is resident-led and collective with a focus on common spaces and facilities, and with a focus on social cohesion and the process of designing collaboratively. Can look like an apartment, it can look like a rural space. The tiny home community, which Anya here is representing today, which is looking at how tiny homes can share common spaces and facilities, and perhaps even that social dynamic of collective decision-making. Then there's the eco-village, which is basically anything, again, can be an eco-village, but it's really about the principles that guide the creation and the ongoing operation of that housing development. And so we have done another presentation last month. In the Common Ground YouTube channel, you will find the presentation there, and that covers the whole gamut of what is the eco-village concept and what it looks like. Then there's the Community Lands Trust, which Peter is representing here today. That is a land legal tenure created for retained affordability, community stability, and community stewardship and inclusion. So that again, some other of these models can happen on top of a community land trust, but so that can look again in different forms from a rural to an apartment. There is the cooperative housing, which Nicholas has mentioned, which is an ownership model with a focus on affordability, but also obviously that social cohesion, being able to have a voice in that ownership. And then there's Papakainga, which is on Maori owned land, and it's usually family led. Some of these can be layered so that you can have a tiny home community that is on a community land trust that calls itself an eco-village. So they're not exclusive to each other. So some of the pieces that when we're thinking about what really makes up resident-led and collective, I would say to start with the purpose, because you saw all those different ones that in the previous slide have different purposes. Some are for ending gentrification, some have a more ecological purpose, some have more of an affordability purpose, and really being clear on what are the values of that project, what's the vision hoping to achieve, what's the greater purpose that it has not only for the residents, but is there other purposes beyond that? So then in that case, you would need a framework, which would be the guidelines, which would help to develop those decisions and processes so that you're able to really make sure that you have a framework that you're always with everything that you do. Proceeding from there is being able to still meet those visions, values, and the purpose. So another piece is the social structures to think about, and there is group decision making. How are you going to do that? Conflict resolution, shared spaces and activities, the creation of and management of, and then the membership structure and the roles. There's the legal aspects, which would be around the legal for land ownership, the legal for building ownership, and to ensure that there is security of tenure. The financial pieces to make sure that there's affordability in some form or another. You're going to hear Bronwyn talk about non-speculative affordability. A community land trust is set up for retained affordability in the long term. And you might then have operational affordability while folks are living there. How are they also living more affordably? Then there's the financial, organizing the finance, and if it's got a bigger purpose, there could also be funding that can be organized. And then there's the ecological considerations, how the land use is going to be designed, the choice of building materials, and then how water, energy, and waste will be considered. And that is all sitting within a larger, could be a watershed that we consider how is ecologically our community contributing in a positive way to that watershed. And then this I've designed, which it's not a finished, but it is something that I've started to work with, which is really sort of that pathway that groups can think about, or if it's a nonprofit organization like a community lands trust or a community housing provider. These are still, you might not have all of these steps, but you'll definitely have some of them. And I've kind of put the ones towards the people at the ones that you'd reached at the beginning, but it's not necessarily so. So this is not necessarily chronological. So in terms of what's inside that pathway, those are the things that the group has a little bit more sort of control over or can do internally. Those are also the things I've identified that common ground that I'm able to help groups and organizations with as well. So again, starting with vision, values, and principles, looking at holistic decision-making, that was that framework, looking at regenerative design and outcomes, if the project has that as part of their value is to be regenerative, needing criteria to choose the land. Pilar talked about that, about the difference between the brown fields and green fields and why one might choose one over the other. Looking at your ownership model, Nicholas talked about the cooperative. So if that's, what kind of ownership model do you want? Or do you want a variation of ownership models? Actually, that can be the case, that on a piece of land, there's various different types. Could have tiny home and a cooperative and another type of ownership. And then you have your membership structure, then the roles and skills of members and stakeholders. You know, what do you have internally that you could use, and what do you need to upskill, and where do you need to bring in those extra skills? Then you have group dynamics and communication, land use design, and you've got, when you come down to putting it onto the ground, you've got project management with its actions, resources, and timelines. And then moving on to the development of the site. You'd also, outside of that pathway, you'd need to consult a legal person to get that land legal structure sorted. And another one is the design of the dwellings. You might call on Pilar for something like that, an architect who's into this sort of thing. And your infrastructure design would, again, be around that water, waste, and energy. Again, if you're thinking ecologically, that would look differently. And then Pilar also spoke about that Green Star and Living Future certification. Do you want your project to be able to get a certification? And then there's processes that need to be followed, and practitioners who can help you with that. There's the zoning and consent. It sort of goes along with the land legal structure, but that's more involving your local councils. And again, some of the things that you do in that inside piece could influence the zoning and consent, like what Peter was saying with the Community Lands Trust. If it's using that model, then you've got other pieces that you might have available, like inclusionary zoning, and you might be able to influence some of the consents or some of the costs around that if you've got a for-purpose or a nonprofit piece of what you're doing. And then you've got the finance structure and access to finance. And that is very much a changing landscape here in Aotearoa, because we've got now shared equity coming in and lower deposits. And so banks are starting to catch on that housing needs to be financed differently. And for instance, the Queenstown Lakes Community Housing Trust works with the SBS Bank because they're more familiar with this kind of a model of shared equity and working with this organization on behalf of the homeowners. And so hopefully we'll see more banks and financing institutions stepping in to do things differently and allowing it to be easier to access finance. And then development on the site. that's a whole nother kettle of fish. And obviously it would help if you get most of these other things figured out before you move into that piece. Now, Bronwyn's going to be sharing with us about non-speculative development, which is, again, touching on that affordability piece, which is that building without the profit motive. And she'll touch probably more on these things. I just thought I'd put together a few things about why would we want to do it this way, because it's easier to reflect the residents' values and needs. It is more affordable. There are more opportunities then to develop the housing site using a regenerative framework. So you're asking different questions rather than what's the profit am I going to get out of it? You're asking questions like, what are going to be the social outcomes and what are going to be the environmental outcomes that we can also achieve by building differently. It does build community in the process because people are having to work together to make decisions from the beginning. It is empowering. People feel like, yes, I can be a part of the solution. I don't have to wait for government or a developer to just provide me with a house. And it obviously increases the available houses that we have, which we definitely need. And then I just wanted to share this as well. Again, a plug for integrated design, because that's something that I'd really like to see more of, and the reason why. So we obviously want better environmental outcomes. We have mandates within our government that we have to do that, and we want better social outcomes. And we also want affordability. That can be a factor that's used against better development because it's rise in cost, but that's not necessarily the case. And in fact, we also look at what builds community wealth. And so if we look at conventional housing as it is at the moment, it's actually quite low in both of those categories. So why would we want to carry on? That's a good question. I think we need to keep asking ourselves, why do we carry on with the conventional? So then we've got things like Green Star communities and buildings, and that is houses that are built with better materials and that are using better processes. And that will be affordable, I think, over time in terms of if you've got better building materials that insulate better and that are better with power usage and things like that, you end up with affordability over time. And then if we look at an integrated systems design, which moves into that using a regenerative framework, you end up with houses and neighborhoods that definitely are achieving simultaneously the environmental outcomes, the social, and it actually can definitely creates affordability over time and increases community wealth. So why not do that? And it's just a matter of just learning, seeing what is possible and upskilling ourselves and being able to speak out when we see conventional housing and being able to question, why are we still doing it this way? So there's actually a wealth of community-led and collective housing in Aotearoa. Some are already established, some are busy getting established. And this is certainly not an inclusive list. This is just what I put together quickly right now. In the Eco Village video, I share some that are specifically under that banner. Then there's the community-led Community Lands Trust video where we share other communities here in Aotearoa, and then here's another list. And it's one of my work is to put together a list where we're able to see, what is this community and where is it and what kind of a community are they? So just to go over briefly, we'll have hear from Bronwyn about the Urban Habitat Collective, which is urban. It's in the heart of Wellington, and it is using a co-housing concept of sharing and collective decision-making, and it's also an apartment. There's Co-House, which is urban in Auckland. It's using co-housing. That's what it's called, and it is more higher density. We have Lotus Eco Village, which I covered in the Eco Village presentation with Ralph as one of the co-founders, and that's semi-rural in Paraparaumu. We have Taora, High Street Co-Housing in Dunedin, which is urban and higher density. We have Tui Community, that's one of the oldest in the country at Wainui Bay, and it's rural and considers itself an eco village. We have Cambridge Co-Housing, which is in my neighborhood, in Peter's neighborhood as well. And they've been formed as a group for about almost 3 years now and are at the process of talking with developers with their vision and they've been doing a lot of that social architecture piece, getting themselves ready for the land. And then Earth Song, again, which is one of the oldest. It's a co-housing up in Auckland, and that welcomes visitors on a quarterly basis to have a tour and to see all of what they're about. And they have an ecological focus.